I still remember that morning clearly, not because something loud or dramatic happened right away, but because everything felt too normal. The sun was just starting to rise, the air was calm, and there was that rare kind of silence you only get when you live far enough away from everyone else. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in my hand, expecting nothing more than another quiet day on my land. No meetings, no emails, no problems, just peace. And then I saw them. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was looking at. Big shapes sitting where nothing should have been. Dark shadows cutting across the ground in a way that felt wrong. I stood there for a few seconds, squinting, telling myself maybe I hadn't woken up fully yet. But as my eyes adjusted, my stomach dropped. Heavy trucks, massive ones, parked right in the middle of my land like they belonged there. There were 6 of them. Dump trucks, flatbeds, concrete mixers. The kind of vehicles you usually see on highways or major construction sites, not on private land miles away from any subdivision. They were lined up neatly, engines off, trailers locked, tires digging deep into soil I paid for. The coffee in my hand went cold, but I didn't notice. All I could think was one question repeating in my head. Who gave them permission? I started walking closer, every step making the situation feel more real. Fresh tire tracks carved through the dirt. Grass crushed flat under thousands of pounds of metal. Dark oil stains already bleeding into the ground. And then I noticed something that turned confusion into pure anger. Hanging from the rearview mirror of each truck was a laminated tag. HOA logo, lot number, authorized parking. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a lost driver or a wrong turn. Someone had made a decision, a calculated one. And that someone was the HOA next door. I pulled out my phone immediately and checked my email. Nothing. No request. No notice. No warning. I checked again just to be sure. Still nothing. They didn't ask. They didn't even bother pretending. They assumed they could use my land and I just accept it. And that assumption is where they made their biggest mistake. You have to understand something about why this bothered me so deeply. I didn't end up next to an HOA by accident. I went out of my way to avoid one. That's why I bought this land in the first place. I wanted space, privacy, control. No letters about grass height, no fines for parking the wrong vehicle, no meetings with people who get power-hungry over rulebooks. Just land and freedom. But about 6 months after I bought the property, things started changing. The subdivision nearby began expanding. New houses went up. New roads were cut in. Construction noise slowly replaced the quiet. And with that expansion came something else. The HOA's attitude started to shift. At first, it was subtle enough to ignore. The first letter arrived saying my fence didn't align with community standards. I laughed and tossed it. The second letter suggested I coordinate any future property changes with the HOA board. That one went straight into the trash too. They had no authority over me, and they knew it. Or at least they should have. Then came the first real red flag. One morning, I noticed bright orange spray paint along the edge of my property. Survey markings. I followed the lines, and my heart sank when I realized they ran straight through my land. Later that day, I found out an HOA surveyor had marked part of my property as temporary equipment overflow. Temporary. Without permission. Without a lease. Without even a conversation. That's when I understood what was really happening. They weren't confused. They were testing me. They wanted to see how far they could push before I pushed back. So I sent an email. Short, polite, and direct. I helped them out by making it very clear. This land is privately owned. You do not have permission to use it for parking, storage, or access. They didn't reply. Not an apology. Not a denial. Not even a courtesy response. 2 days later, the trucks showed up. When I called the HOA office, the tone on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. They weren't concerned. They weren't embarrassed. They sounded almost amused. They told me it was temporary. They said it would only be for a short while. And then came the sentence that changed everything. We assumed you wouldn't mind. That's when it stopped being about land and started being about respect. because that sentence meant they didn't see me as an owner. They saw me as someone they could ignore, someone they thought wouldn't fight back. Standing there, looking at my land being used like a free parking lot, I made a quiet decision. If they wanted to play games, I would play by the rules. Just not their rules. What they didn't know was that my property had one small detail that would change everything. At the back of the land sat a heavy steel access gate. Old, solid, and connected to a county-maintained service road. That road was the only way vehicles that size could enter or leave. Too narrow everywhere else. Too soft. Too steep. Once those trucks came in, that gate was their only way out. As the sun started setting that evening, I looked back at the trucks one more time. Then I looked at the gate. And that's when it hit me. They drove in thinking they controlled the situation. But they never once stopped to think about how they were going to leave. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was nervous, but because my mind was already planning the next move. Something legal. Something calm. Something that would involve people the HOA couldn't intimidate. Because the next call I was going to make wouldn't be to them at all. It would be to the county. And once the county gets involved, there's no such thing as temporary anymore. That next morning, I woke up with a strange calm. Not relief. Not excitement. Just clarity. The kind you get when you already know what you're going to do and there's no debate left in your head. I didn't rush. I didn't make angry phone calls. I didn't even look toward the trucks at first. I grabbed my keys, got into my pickup, and drove toward the back of my land like it was just another normal day. The trucks were still there, exactly where they'd been the night before. Silent, heavy, unbothered. They looked almost smug sitting there, like they'd already claimed the place. But I didn't stop. I kept driving, past the dirt path, past the fence line, all the way to the gate. The gate wasn't anything fancy. No warning signs. No reflective paint. Just thick steel bars bolted into the ground decades ago. It wasn't designed to look intimidating. But it didn't need to. Anyone who understood machinery knew one thing the moment they saw it. If that gate was closed, nothing big was getting through without permission. I parked the truck and stepped out. The air was cold, and the metal of the gate felt even colder under my hand. I stood there longer than I needed to, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what this meant. Once I did this, there was no undo button. This wasn't a threat. This was action. I went to the back of my truck and pulled out a heavy chain and a thick industrial lock. The kind used on construction sites when equipment actually matters. I wrapped the chain through the gate slowly, deliberately, then snapped the lock shut. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed in my chest. That single click felt heavier than any argument I could have had with the HOA. I sat back in my truck for a moment and stared at the gate. Then I took out my phone. I didn't call the HOA. That was important. Instead, I searched for the county zoning and code enforcement number. When someone answered, I spoke calmly, like this was the most normal thing in the world. I told them there were multiple heavy commercial vehicles parked on my private land without permission. I explained there were no permits, no agreements, and no authorization of any kind. The tone on the other end of the line changed instantly. They asked for the address. They asked how long the vehicles had been there. They asked if I had given consent. When I said no, firmly and clearly, there was a pause. Then they told me inspectors would be sent out within 2 business days. I thanked them and hung up. That was it. No yelling, no threats, and no drama. Just letting the system do what it was designed to do. By the afternoon, the HOA realized something was wrong. One of the drivers came back to move a truck. He drove forward a few feet, turned toward the exit, and then stopped. He got out, stared at the gate, and pulled out his phone. I watched from a distance as confusion turned into frustration. Calls were made. Voices were raised. Hands waved in the air like that would somehow unlock steel. That's when my phone rang. HOA property manager. I let it ring. Then it rang again. Different number. Same area code. HOA board member. Ignored. By the third call, I listened to the voicemail. The voice on the other end tried to sound professional, but panic leaked through every word. They said there was an access issue. They said the trucks needed to be moved. They asked me to call back as soon as possible. Not once did they say sorry. Not once did they say please. They still thought this was a small inconvenience, something I'd fix for them. I didn't call back. 2 days later, county vehicles rolled onto my land. White trucks with official logos, inspectors stepping out with clipboards and cameras. They didn't ask me what I wanted to happen. They already knew. They walked straight to the trucks, circling them like predators who had already spotted weakness. They measured distances from the road. They checked the ground underneath for contamination. They looked for permits taped inside windows. There were none. One inspector crouched down and photographed an oil leak spreading into the soil. Another shook his head quietly while writing something down. One of them looked at me and said, almost casually, "These vehicles can't be stored here, not even temporarily." That single sentence was more satisfying than any argument I could have won. Bright orange notices were taped onto each truck. Big, ugly papers that screamed violation from across the land. Unauthorized commercial vehicle storage. Environmental risk. Daily fines starting immediately. And at the bottom, in bold letters that changed everything, it said the vehicles were subject to seizure if not removed within 72 hours. That's when the HOA really panicked. They didn't send emails anymore. They showed up in person. 3 board members and the property manager stood outside my fence, talking fast, stepping on each other's words. They said it was a misunderstanding. They said they never meant for it to go this far. They said we should work together to fix this. I listened quietly. Then I reminded them of something simple. They parked 6 heavy trucks on my land without permission. They damaged my soil. They ignored my warning. This wasn't sudden. This was the result of choices they made. They asked me to unlock the gate. I said no. They said I was being unreasonable. I told them I was being lawful. And that's when it finally hit them. This wasn't a neighbor dispute anymore. This wasn't something they could vote on in a meeting. The county was involved now, and the county doesn't care about HOA politics. They walked away slower than they arrived, shoulders tight, voices low. They were running out of time, and they knew it. That night, I checked the clock before going to bed. 48 hours left. The trucks hadn't moved. The gate was still locked. And the county had already scheduled what came next. Because after warnings come fines. And after fines, come tow trucks big enough to move anything. The next 2 days felt strange. Not tense. Not chaotic. Just heavy. Like the air itself knew something big was coming. Every time I looked out across my land, those trucks were still there, sitting silently like ticking clocks. The HOA had 72 hours. That deadline was real, printed in bold on those orange notices, and the clock didn't care about excuses. By the second morning, the fines had already started adding up. Daily fines. Per vehicle. 6 trucks. Every hour they sat there was costing the HOA more money than they'd ever expected to spend on temporary parking. And the worst part for them was this. There was nothing they could do without my cooperation. My phone rang constantly. Numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails piling up. At first, it was still polite. Requests. Let's talk. We can figure this out. But as the hours passed, the tone shifted. Voices got sharper. Messages got shorter. One voicemail ended with silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then a quiet, angry breath before they hung up. On the 3rd day, the HOA's lawyer called. That one I answered. Not because I was scared, but because I was curious. His voice was calm, professional, carefully controlled. He talked about liability. He talked about cooperation. He talked about how this could go a lot easier for everyone. When he finally paused, I told him the truth. The trucks were parked illegally. The county had already documented everything. I hadn't blocked access illegally. The gate was mine. And any attempt to force entry would only make things worse for his client. There was a pause on the line. A real one. Not the kind people use to think. The kind they use when they realize they're losing. He asked what I wanted. That question told me everything. Because if they truly believed they were right, they wouldn't be asking. I told him I wanted my land restored and my peace respected. Nothing more. Nothing less. He didn't respond right away. He just said he'd relay the message and hung up. By that afternoon, the HOA president showed up again. This time alone. No clipboard. No attitude. Just a man sweating through his shirt, standing at the fence like he was waiting for a verdict. He didn't waste time pretending anymore. He admitted they never expected me to push back. He admitted they assumed I'd complain, maybe threaten, and then give in. He even admitted they thought I'd be scared of legal trouble. That honesty would have mattered more if it hadn't come so late. He asked me, quietly, if we could unlock the gate just long enough to move the trucks out. He said they'd handle everything else afterward. Repairs, cleanup, apologies, promises. I looked past him at the trucks. I told him no, because by then, this wasn't about moving trucks. This was about consequences. They crossed a line, and lines only mean something if crossing them costs you. The 72 hours expired at sunrise the next day. Right on time, county tow trucks rolled in. These weren't the small ones you see pulling sedans off city streets. These were massive machines built to move the immovable. Steel cables thicker than my arm. Engines that growled like animals waking up hungry. County officials walked the site one last time, checking paperwork, matching VIN numbers, taking final photos. Everything was calm, efficient, cold. The way real authority always looks. The HOA arrived late. Cars pulled up fast. Doors opened hard. Board members rushed out, voices already raised. They tried to argue, tried to interrupt, tried to say they were working on a solution. One county officer shut it down with a single sentence. The deadline had passed. The vehicles were now subject to seizure. And just like that, it was over. Chains were attached. Locks were cut. One by one, the trucks were dragged out. Tires resisted. Metal screamed. Dirt tore open where the weight had settled too deep. Neighbors came out to watch. Phones held up. Whispers spreading fast. This wasn't just happening to the HOA. This was happening in front of everyone. Each truck that left felt lighter than the last. Not because I hated them, but because every inch of land they freed felt like something being returned. By noon, all 6 were gone. What was left behind was damage. Ruts carved deep into the soil. Oil stains dark against the dirt. Broken grass and crushed drainage lines. County officials documented everything again. Environmental assessments were scheduled. Cleanup orders were issued. The fines didn't stop when the trucks left. They multiplied. Unauthorized land use. Environmental contamination. Failure to comply within deadline. Tens of thousands of dollars. None of it covered by HOA insurance. That part spread through the neighborhood faster than anything else. Suddenly, people who never questioned HOA decisions started asking uncomfortable questions. Where did the money come from? Why was the board making decisions without permission? Who approved using private land? And for the first time since I bought that property, the HOA went quiet. No letters to no emails, no suggestions. Just silence. That silence felt better than any apology. Because silence meant understanding. It meant they finally knew something they should have known from the beginning. My land was not theirs. My patience was not weakness. And authority doesn't come from confidence or numbers. It comes from standing on the right side of the law. A few days later, I unlocked the gate. Not because they asked, but because there was nothing left to keep locked. The land was empty again, quiet again, mine again. And as I stood there, looking across the damage they left behind, I didn't feel angry. I felt satisfied. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't raise your voice. It's close a gate and let the consequences roll in. After the trucks were gone, the silence felt different. Not the calm I had bought this land for, but the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. The kind where everyone around knows something has changed, even if they don't say it. I spent that morning walking along the dirt where the trucks had been parked. Deep ruts ran across the property, oil stains dark and persistent. Yet somehow, seeing it all left me feeling powerful, not defeated. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about control, boundaries, and standing firm. Word of what happened spread quickly. Neighbors who barely acknowledged each other in passing were now whispering over fences. Phones buzzed with texts I hadn't expected, some congratulatory, some incredulous. People were stunned that the HOA, a group most of them treated as untouchable, had been humbled so publicly. Their shock was almost amusing. I overheard a neighbor saying, "Did you hear? They actually got towed. On private land." It was surreal to realize that by defending what was mine, I'd also shifted the perception of authority in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the HOA was unraveling internally. Board meetings that used to be perfunctory and confident turned tense and chaotic. Emails leaked among members, showing frustration, blame, and panic. Some argued they should have contacted the landowner before escalating. Others claimed they had acted on assumptions because they thought the property was within HOA purview. Every conversation, every message, only confirmed what I already knew. Power without accountability is fragile. Their arrogance, which had fueled the decision to park trucks illegally, was crumbling under the weight of law and consequence. The county fines were a devastating punch. Environmental assessments and daily penalties added up quickly. The HOA insurance couldn't cover the cost because this was considered deliberate action, not accident. Suddenly, board members who had previously carried themselves with authority were forced to explain to the community why tens of thousands of dollars were being spent on mistakes they could have avoided. Some members quietly resigned. Others tried to spin the story, but the evidence was undeniable. Photographs of ruts, oil stains, and official notices made it impossible to deny wrongdoing. Watching this unfold, I felt a strange sense of detachment. Part of me wanted to gloat, but the smarter, calmer part focused on what this meant long-term. The HOA had learned, at least temporarily, that there were limits to their power. Rules matter only when applied fairly and legally. And as long as property owners are willing to stand their ground, unchecked assumptions or intimidation tactics are powerless. This wasn't a personal victory. It was a demonstration that boundaries matter, and respect is earned, not assumed. The neighbors' reactions continued to provide unexpected insights. People who had silently tolerated overreach in the past now spoke up. Conversations shifted from petty complaints about aesthetics or fences to serious discussions about property rights and community accountability. Some neighbors admitted they had been intimidated by the HOA before, fearing fines or disputes over minor infractions. But seeing the HOA humbled by real consequences emboldened them. In subtle ways, the neighborhood culture began to shift. Authority was no longer untouchable. Accountability became tangible. I spent the next week repairing the land. Not because I had to, but because it symbolized reclaiming ownership in every sense. Oil-stained soil was treated. Ruts were leveled where possible. Grass was replanted. Every repair was a quiet declaration. This land is mine, and I protect it. At the same time, I documented everything. Photographs, notes, even short video clips showing the repairs and the previous damage. Not for the HOA, not for the county, but for me, a reminder of how far things had escalated and how strong taking the right steps could be. By the second week, the HOA had mostly disappeared from my radar. No letters, no emails, no calls. It was as if the land itself had reclaimed authority over them. And while I didn't underestimate the possibility they might try something else, the public nature of the incident and the legal consequences meant any further overreach would be even riskier for them. The dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I had demonstrated that compliance, legality, and boundaries carry weight that arrogance cannot override. What amazed me most, however, was the subtle shift in personal confidence this experience brought. I realized something profound. Defending your rights doesn't require aggression, theatrics, or revenge. It requires clarity, calmness, and an understanding of the law. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't escalate beyond what was necessary. And yet, by doing nothing extra and everything right, the outcome was decisive. The trucks were gone. The fines were imposed. Respect had been regained. In the following weeks, I noticed small gestures from the HOA that hadn't existed before. A board member hesitated before sending a letter. A property manager walked by without making a suggestion. Even casual neighbors who were previously indifferent now gave a polite nod when passing. I knew it wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. They recognized boundaries. And sometimes, recognition is the first step toward lasting change. Looking back, I realized this entire ordeal was a lesson in both patience and assertiveness. It was a reminder that assuming authority without accountability is dangerous, that legal channels exist for a reason, and that standing firm, calmly and lawfully, can shift power dynamics in ways intimidation never will. What had begun as a minor clash over property lines had transformed into a profound assertion of ownership, rights, and personal integrity. That's the power of understanding limits, not just for yourself but for others. The HOA had learned their lesson the hard way, and I had learned mine in a way that reinforced something essential. Sometimes the best action isn't a confrontation, but a well-placed boundary, backed by the system. And in the end, boundaries, respect, and patience proved far stronger than arrogance and assumptions ever could. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt different. Not loud or chaotic, just aware. Conversations over fences weren't the usual small talk anymore. Neighbors who had once rolled their eyes at HOA letters now asked questions, quietly seeking insight into what had actually happened on my land. Some admitted they had been intimidated before, silently tolerating overreach because they didn't think anyone would challenge it. Seeing the outcome on my property gave them courage they hadn't realized they had. Authority, they discovered, wasn't as untouchable as they'd been led to believe. The HOA tried to recover their image, but it was futile. Board meetings turned into strategic sessions on damage control rather than planning or enforcing aesthetics. Some members openly blamed each other. Others, realizing the legal and financial consequences, quietly resigned. The insurance companies involved made it clear that the events were deliberate, which meant no payouts and no shortcuts. Tens of thousands of dollars were lost, not to mention credibility that would take years to repair, if ever. Watching their unraveling, I realized something crucial. Arrogance can only thrive when unchecked. Once there's accountability, it collapses fast. Meanwhile, my land slowly began to heal. Ruts leveled, oil treated, grass replanted. Every repair wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a statement. This is mine. My rules, my property, my peace. It was therapeutic, watching something that had been abused gradually restored. Documenting each step, I kept photographs, videos, and notes. It wasn't for anyone else. It was a reminder of what persistence and clarity could achieve when backed by the right actions. Every step forward was a reaffirmation of ownership and responsibility. People started coming to me for advice, not because I sought it, but because the story had become impossible to ignore. Neighbors, friends, and even some from nearby communities wanted to know how I handled the situation. They asked about legality, strategy, and timing. I shared the basics. Know your rights, document everything, involve authorities when appropriate, and don't react impulsively. The results weren't about aggression, they were about strategy and understanding how systems work. And seeing the confidence that spread among neighbors reminded me that standing firm has consequences far beyond the initial conflict. The HOA, for their part, became almost invisible. Letters stopped. Emails dried up. Requests for meetings vanished. Even casual attempts to suggest improvements were carefully considered and quickly abandoned. It was subtle but unmistakable. They now knew there were limits, and my enforcement of them had changed how they operated. Boundaries, I realized, weren't just a personal safeguard. They were a tool that reshaped community dynamics. By standing firm, I had shifted the balance of power, not with anger, but with clarity and legality. One moment in particular stood out. A neighbor walked by, someone I had only nodded to in the past. This time, she smiled and said quietly, "I'm glad someone finally stood up to them." That brief acknowledgement struck me harder than any confrontation with the HOA. It wasn't about recognition for me, it was about changing a culture of fear into a culture of accountability. People realized that the rules only matter if everyone has the courage to enforce them, and I had demonstrated that without shouting, lawsuits, or drama. The lessons from this experience went deeper than land and HOA conflicts. They were lessons about life, about respect, and about patience. It became clear that authority only has meaning when supported by fairness and accountability. Assumptions and arrogance are fragile, easily shattered when someone stands firm and knows the rules. And patience, quiet, deliberate patience, proved more powerful than any outburst of anger. By allowing the system to work as it was intended, I had enforced consequences that words alone could never have achieved. Looking back, I also realized how much confidence this gave me personally. Defending my rights didn't require aggression or theatrics. It required clarity, calmness, and an understanding of how the law functions. I didn't have to threaten, yell, or escalate. I simply identified the right course of action, executed it correctly, and allowed natural consequences to unfold. The result was decisive. The trucks were gone, the fines imposed, and respect regained. Boundaries, I learned, are more effective than any argument or debate when clearly established and legally supported. Even months later, I noticed the subtle changes in behavior around me. The HOA members who remained were careful, deliberate, and far less bold than before. Neighbors became more engaged, more aware, and less intimidated. Conversations about property, rights, and boundaries replaced discussions about trivial aesthetics. And though I never sought recognition, the quiet nods and respectful distance people gave me reflected a broader shift. Sometimes the strongest statement isn't visible or loud. It's in the way others now approach you and the choices they make in response. The long-term impact was undeniable. My property remained mine, legally and symbolically. The HOA's influence had waned, at least over me. The county had established a clear precedent: illegal action, no matter how temporary, has consequences. And the neighborhood culture had evolved. People understood that compliance isn't just about fear of fines. It's about respect for boundaries and acknowledgement that rules apply to everyone equally. The ripple effect was small but meaningful, a subtle reshaping of authority and accountability in a place where many had assumed power was absolute. What amazed me most was that this entire ordeal had started from a single simple action: standing firm and taking the right steps. No shouting, no vengeance, just clear understanding of rights and boundaries, combined with the patience to let consequences unfold naturally. It was a lesson in strategy, law, and psychology all at once. I had learned that sometimes the most effective way to teach a lesson is not to react emotionally, but to act decisively and lawfully, letting others' choices determine the outcome. Months passed, and life on my land slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The trucks were gone, the ruts and oil stains were being repaired, and the county fines had done their work. Yet, even in this calm, I felt a shift, a subtle change in the way the neighborhood moved, in the way the HOA approached not just me but everyone around. The arrogance they once carried like armor had been replaced by caution, even fear. It was a powerful reminder that consequences, when executed properly, speak louder than words. The HOA board never recovered fully from that week. Meetings became tense, decisions scrutinized, and members increasingly hesitant to act without legal advice. Their internal emails revealed frustration, blame, and quiet panic. Some resigned quietly, unable to deal with the embarrassment and financial loss. Others stayed, but their influence was diminished. They had learned something essential the hard way: assuming authority over others' property without consent comes at a price. And that price isn't just monetary. It's credibility, reputation, and trust, all of which they had lost. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had changed subtly but permanently. Conversations over fences, once polite and mundane, now included careful discussions of property rights and boundaries. Neighbors who had once silently tolerated overreach were emboldened. I began receiving questions from people curious about how I handled the situation, how I knew what to do, and how they could protect themselves if faced with similar challenges. It was strange and gratifying to realize that my actions, calm and lawful as they were, had inspired others to stand firm. Respect, I realized, is contagious when paired with clear boundaries. On my land, I continued repairs. Ruts leveled, oil treated, grass replanted. Each effort wasn't just maintenance. It was reclamation, a quiet reinforcement of ownership. I documented every step, not for the HOA or the county, but for myself, a record of persistence, strategy, and the consequences of standing firm. Looking at the repaired land, I felt satisfaction, not pride. It wasn't about victory over others. It was about reaffirming control over my own space and demonstrating that rules, when properly applied, protect everyone. The lessons went deeper than land disputes. I realized that patience and clarity are more powerful than aggression. Legal authority is stronger than intimidation. Boundaries, when enforced wisely, reshape not just situations, but entire dynamics of power. The HOA had underestimated me, assuming that silence or compliance would be my default response. They were wrong, and their failure demonstrated a universal truth. Authority without accountability is fragile. The moment consequences enter the equation, assumptions crumble. Neighbors' reactions reinforced this understanding. Casual acknowledgments, polite nods, and quiet conversations reflected a broader cultural shift. People were no longer intimidated by the HOA's presence. They understood that rules are meaningful only when applied fairly, and that everyone has the right to enforce their boundaries. Observing this change, I recognized the wider impact of my decision. This wasn't just about a gate or 6 trucks. It was about respect, accountability, and understanding one's rights. Looking back, I saw that this entire ordeal had transformed me. I learned that standing firm doesn't require aggression or theatrics. It requires clarity, strategy, and patience. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't escalate unnecessarily. I identified the proper course of action, executed it precisely, and allowed natural consequences to unfold. The outcome, trucks removed, fines imposed, respect regained, was decisive. And the quiet satisfaction of knowing I acted wisely reinforced a lesson I'll carry forever. Boundaries, legality, and patience are stronger than arrogance. The HOA's reaction, the county's involvement, and the neighborhood's newfound awareness all reinforced this truth. I didn't seek recognition, yet acknowledgement came in subtle ways. Conversations shifted. Behavior changed. Authority once assumed was now scrutinized. And the lesson extended beyond my property. Anyone watching this story unfold would see that standing firm, knowing your rights, and using the proper channels can achieve far more than intimidation, confrontation, or anger. Ultimately, the trucks were gone, the fines had been paid, and the HOA had learned its lesson. My land was mine again, quiet and intact. But the true victory wasn't in seeing them towed or paying penalties. It was in demonstrating that respect and accountability matter, that patience and lawfulness carry weight, and that anyone willing to stand firm can change dynamics in profound ways. What started as a conflict over trucks and boundaries became a lesson in courage, strategy, and persistence. A story that would be remembered by those who witnessed it, and perhaps a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to assume power without consequence. As I stood at the back gate one evening, looking over my property, I reflected on everything that had happened. The sun was low, shadows stretching across the repaired ground. It was quiet, truly quiet, and in that silence, I understood that standing firm isn't about winning fights. It's about protecting what is yours, teaching lessons without violence, and letting consequences do the work that anger never could. That's the real power. That's the real respect. And in that moment I felt finally complete.